Things I think the Chinese regime does better than the British regime, based on my experience living and working in and around China since 2013, and as a PhD researcher specialising in Chinese governance. There is something so freeing about being called a CCP propagandist by some and a CIA asset by others, because no matter what, I'm going to end up with trolls in the comments. So I might as well just be honest about some of the undeniably democratic practices that I've observed in my research on China. I know I've lost some of you already with this, but the first thing that I think Chinese local authorities do better than their British counterparts is protest management. Hear me out. Whenever anyone says protest in China, the first thing most people will think of is this image. The image, not the actual full video showing this incredibly brave / stupid / no more F's left to give citizen bashing the tank with his shopping bag. Most people will have seen this image and let the mainstream media make their assumptions for them. What do you think of when you think of protest in the UK? Do you think of this image from the Battle of Orgreave in 1984? Or do you think of this image from the poll tax riots of 1991? Probably not, because we know how much can change in 40 years. So what does protest management look like in China today? If the New York Times is to be believed, protest barely happens in the world's largest and most successful authoritarian regime. As I wrote in this article for the London School of Economics, the New York Times alone reported on the rare Henan Bank protests of July 2022, the rare Bridgeman protests in Beijing 3 months later, and the rare protests against COVID-related income issues in Guangzhou 1 month after that. Protest is absolutely not rare in China. In fact, it happens so often that local Chinese governments regularly have to write new protocols for how to deal with the ever-evolving portfolio of techniques employed by protesters. And here we get to why I think the Chinese regime manages protests so much better than the British regime. Because the Chinese regime, the central party state located in Beijing, the centre of political power, keeps its nose out of most protests. Protest management in China is radically decentralised. Local grassroots governments, generally street level or village level, the smallest types of governments in the entire Chinese governance system, they are responsible for responding to and managing protests. Admittedly, their overarching aim is demobilisation. Get protesters off the street as quickly as possible and restore social stability. And this is where the shadow of the regime, rather than the regime itself, serves to steer local government behaviours. If they turn immediately to repression and repress too harshly, triggering further repeat protests and public outrage across social media, for example, higher-level governments will step in and punish the offending local government officials. However, if they're too lenient and they offer concessions that the regime or high-level governments aren't willing or able to provide, internal disciplinary mechanisms kick in and punish the offending local government officials. As a result, local governments rarely turn to repression first, and protesters rarely turn to violence first. Protest is understood as a legitimate conversation between citizens and the state. And I mean that literally, it is a conversation. A local government mediator will arrive to hear from protest leaders and understand the grievance. The most common type of grievances in China are generally labour-related, so private companies behaving badly, not paying wages, unsafe or oppressive working conditions, dong. And government mediators then have the power to speak directly with these companies and force them to abide by their existing contracts or to the letter of the law. We see a similar dynamic when it comes to other types of protests, like homeowner protests. Again, generally against companies behaving badly, and a local government mediator will step in to either punish that company or to recommend changes to legislation to make sure that behaviour can't happen again. While the regime in my country tends to protect companies at all costs, Chinese local governments are far harsher on corporate misbehaviour, at least where domestic companies are concerned. But what I find most problematic about the British regime's approach to protest management is that so much of it is so mercilessly top-down. The current Labour government has not and absolutely will not revoke the spate of anti-protest legislation that was forced through by the previous Conservative government, often, according to some, without proper democratic due process. This legislation means that the decision over whether or not a protest is legal or illegal has been radically centralised to the Secretary of State. One person has the power to decide whether a protest is legal or illegal according to this new anti-protest legislation. In China, that decision has to go through multiple layers of government, from the city level all the way up to the province, and then eventually, sometimes, occasionally, to the regime level. There is a lot more nuance behind all of this that I would absolutely love to get into. For example, protest management gets way more complicated when Chinese citizens protest against government action rather than the misbehaviour of private companies, like when Chinese villagers protest against government land grabs or forced demolitions. If you want to know more about this, drop a comment and I'll record a follow-up video. If you just want to get an idea of what Chinese protests look like in real life on the ground, you can check out the Wikidonna database, which I cite in the LSE article that I mentioned a minute ago, and which you can find via the link in my bio.